Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Leslie Yuso, board member of the Rancho Mirage Library and Observatory. We're very happy to welcome you here. Of course, please silence your cell phones because I think you're in for a very fascinating hour. It's so important for the foundation to have your direct community support through donations and sponsorships to the library and observatory. We fund nearly all collection development and programs. And if you haven't picked up your calendar of events, we still have a lot of wonderful and interesting programs yet to come. You can see what's going on our website also, or pick up a program book at the back of the room. I also want to welcome Michael O'Keefe, council board member. Michael, right here. You want to stand up? And today we are also honored to be partnering with the Coachella Valley Journalism Foundation to present this afternoon program, The History of Political Cartoons and Newspaper Opinions in America. The foundation was founded in 2020. Its mission is to promote and support sustainable community journalism in the Coachella Valley. Here at the library, this is a mission we are very, very proud to be behind. And here to introduce today's program is Julie Makinen from the board of the Coachella Valley Foundation. Thanks, Julie.
Thank you so much. I'm going to tip this down because I'm so short. So on behalf of the Coachella Valley Journalism Foundation, welcome to the program. I'm Julie Makinen. I'm on the board. And I assume if you are here that, like me, you are a lover of opinion pages and political cartoons. And the way I think about it is the best political cartoons cut through all the hot air and all the chatter and really just get to the heart of the matter, and you know it when you see it. They make us think. And today we are going to delve into the history of this, I guess, uniquely American art form, or I think of it as somewhat uniquely American art form. You're going to see a variety of cartoons, some of which you may totally agree with, and others of which you may not, and that is totally fine. Just go with it. Leading us on this journey is Mike Thompson. He's a longtime cartoonist for newspapers including the Detroit Free Press, the Minneapolis Star Tribune, and USA Today. Mike is a not one, not two, not three, but four-time Pulitzer finalist, which is really amazing. He's also the winner of multiple awards, including the Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award for Cartooning, two-time Society of Professional Journalists National Cartooning Award. He's won awards from the Overseas Press Club, the National Press Foundation, the National Headliner Award, and many other respected organizations. So you're in the hands of a great expert here. And joining Mike is Nicky Loomis, the Desert Sun's opinion and engagement editor. Nicky has a big job with the Desert Sun. She convenes the editorial board, which is actually composed of a majority of members from the community, so not Desert Sun employees, but ordinary folks just like you. She also edits letters to the editor, Valley Voices, and columns, and she organizes the newspaper's endorsement process during election season. And Nicky's position is funded by our foundation, and without this funding, there would be no letters and no Valley Voices and definitely no cartoons in the Desert Sun. So this is just one of the multiple ways that Coachella Valley Journalism Foundation is supporting local media. And we also fund internships and fellowships and reporting trips for reporters in newsrooms across the valley, not just the Desert Sun. We've worked with KSQ and Coachella Valley Independent and a number of other outlets and publications, and we put on programs like this. So we believe that strong, trustworthy journalism helps make our community stronger. So I hope you'll consider getting involved with us by volunteering or donating. And we'll have a little bit more on that later. But Nicky and Mike are going to take it from here, and after about 30 minutes, you'll have the chance to ask questions. And running around with the microphone will be our board member, Carrie Braisman. And I just want to give a big shout out to Carrie because he was the one who really organized this event and made it happen, and worked with Mike and Nicky on the program and all the logistics, so thank you, Carrie. And then after the Q&A, we'll conclude with a few remarks from Randy Lovely, our board president. But with that, please give a warm welcome to Mike and Nicky.
Well, first of all, thank you all for coming out here on this fine day, and thank you to the Coachella Valley Journalism Foundation and to the library for supporting this programming. My name is Mike Thompson. I had a 35-year career as a political cartoonist, and I've brought some slides to show you. Here's a slide, and here's a slide, and here's a slide. What is an editorial cartoon, and why do they matter? Simply put, an editorial cartoon is an illustrated opinion. They are visual columns in which the creator expresses an opinion in a visual format, often relying on humor to make as the sugar to make the medicine go down. In the early days, editorial cartoons were illustrated headlines relying on labeled and hackneyed cliches to make their point. But as each new generation of cartoonists came along, that changed and the art form evolved. Editorial cartoons mattered in the early years for the same reason they matter today, visual impact. In the 18th and 19th centuries, photographs and publications were not as ubiquitous as they are today, meaning that a strong visual embedded in a sea of text packed an incredible punch. Nowadays, the internet is driven by visuals, and as a visual medium, editorial cartoons are right at home. Their ability to deliver a quick message appeals to our short attention spans. Their snark and pithy edge appeal to Americans accustomed to tremendously popular late-night comedians. As you will see, their relevance has continually ebbed and flowed throughout American history. As the late, great, three-time Pulitzer Prize-winning editorial cartoonist Jeff McNally said, quote, "Cartoons are really a negative art form. You never say anything nice. You're always criticizing and dumping on people," end quote. But as I say, it's good to speak out against bad things. So an editorial cartoon appears on the editorial page. And what's the difference between the editorial page and the rest of the newspaper? As an editor friend of mine said, in the rest of the newspaper, we tell you what we know. On the opinion or the editorial page, we tell you what we think about what we know. And there are several components to an editorial page. Actually, first, here's an example of a political cartoon I drew on Dr. Fauci and COVID. The first woman says, "I hear COVID vaccines cause infertility. I hear they contain microchips. I hear they cause autism." Dr. Fauci saying, "It's important to develop herd immunity." As I said, the newspaper opinion page consists of several elements. First is the institutional voice of the newspaper, the editorial. Then comes the columnists. After that comes the letters from readers. And then after that comes the cartoonist. No, wait, there's the cartoonist. And here are a few more examples of editorial cartoons. You'll notice I'm saying editorial cartoons and not political cartoons because I don't stalker who relentlessly tracks you and snoops into your personal business on the right. Social issues are also important fodder for a political or an editorial cartoonist. As you'll see in this next cartoon, I wanted to comment on the movie Wonder Woman when it first came out. So here I have Wonder Woman and a working mom, and the working mom saying, "Big deal, I'm a single mom who works 2 part-time jobs on 5 hours sleep." And the caption is Wonder Woman. Ben Franklin, America's first editorial cartoonist. Now, you may know Ben Franklin as a founding father and for his experiments with kites and electricity. But did you know that Franklin is also credited with publishing one of the first political cartoons in America? In 1754, Franklin was publisher of the Pennsylvania Gazette and ran this cartoon before attending a conference to discuss the threat from the Native American and French troops to the British prior to the French and Indian War, according to the National Constitution Center. The cartoon found new life during the crises leading up to the Revolutionary War, and altered versions are still published to this day. And here you can see the famous Join or Die cartoon that ran in 1754 in the Pennsylvania Gazette. Next, we go on to William Randolph Hearst. Now, William Randolph Hearst was a newspaper baron born to a mining fortune. Hearst took control of the San Francisco Chronicle in 1887 and became the largest publisher of newspapers and magazines in the entire world. By the 1930s, Hearst newspapers were read by 20 million Americans each day. Elected to Congress twice, Hearst also ran unsuccessfully for president, mayor of New York City, and governor of New York. He is perhaps best known for his promotion of the war with Spain and sensationalistic yellow journalism, a term some credit to the then famous Yellow Kid comic strip character. Hearst newspapers reflected the opinions of their publishers, and this extended to political cartoons. You can see Hearst, because he had so much power and so much influence, was often criticized in other newspapers. And this cartoon, which ran in the early 1900s, Hearst as the Wizard of Oz. And here he is as the Scarecrow from the Wizard of Oz book, which was first published in 1900. And you can see that there were a lot of people at the time who were very much concerned about the power and the influence that one man had. And here's another example when he was trying to run for governor of the state of New York, only a stepping stone, and he's stepping onto the Capitol in Albany, New York, where he lived, using it as a stepping stone to the White House. And at this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Nicky.
Can you hear me? Awesome, thank you. Next slide. Yeah. So just going back a bit, here we are in 1841, and Horace Greeley is sort of the godfather of creating the editorial page. And his newspaper, the New York Tribune, was wildly successful. It was read just across the country. And I just picked out one of these early kind of near where the masthead would be, so you could see sort of a daily listing of articles. And as you can see, it's already separated out in 1841. And the concept here was just that from this very kind of forward-thinking newspaperman, the idea of like splitting facts and news from opinion and thoughts was sort of invented, quote unquote, by him. Next slide. And then I just added this one because, so we're going to jump forward now to 1862. And up here, he wrote like a very lengthy letter to President Lincoln called The Prayer of 20 Million. And I highly encourage you to read it when you have time. But what was so fascinating was that Lincoln responded to him directly, and it was picked up across newspapers nationwide. So this, to me, is a perfect example of kind of the beauty of what an opinion page can and
Thomas Nast, the grandfather of American political cartooning. The late 19th and early 20th century represented one of the golden eras of political cartooning. Advances in printing techniques and newspaper circulation wars fueled the rise of visual journalism in general and editorial cartoons in particular. Thomas Nast was the grandfather of American political cartooning. No one embodied this golden era more than Thomas Nast. Born in Germany in 1840, Nast's family immigrated to America when he was 6, settling in New York. He earned his chops as an illustrator for Harper's Weekly during the Civil War, creating illustrations of the conflicts. Photography was relatively new, and so publications relied on illustrators. Nast is credited with creating the elephant and donkey as symbols of America's two political parties, as well as Uncle Sam and our modern-day version of Santa Claus. So he was a very influential political cartoonist. In the Reconstruction era, he lambasted discrimination in the Ku Klux Klan. Unfortunately, he's also remembered for his ugly stereotypes of Irish immigrants. But what Nast is most remembered for are his cartoons about New York State Senator Marcy Tweed, or Boss Tweed as he was called. head of the corrupt Tammany Hall political machine in New York. And a political machine is a loose organization of politicians and people in power who swap votes for political favors and jobs. He was so successful that Tweed tried bribing Nast with a $100,000 bribe to quit cartooning and just walk away. Now remember, this was the late 18th century. Nast successfully bid them up to $500,000 before telling them to go take a flying leap. He was not going to be swayed or bought off. It was a small fortune in those days. When Tweed left office, finally, after being forced out largely by Nast and his cartoons, he was recognized overseas by someone who had seen Nast's cartoons. And in Boss Marcy Tweed's luggage were copies of the cartoons that Nast had drawn about him. And here he is, Thomas Nast. Oops. This is the Who Stole the People's Money? And you can see everybody's pointing to each other, going around in a giant circle here. And one of the really interesting things about this is how he actually draws the cartoon. You can see there's much more black and solid colors, use of black in the foreground. In the back, it's very minimal, so it creates a 3D effect on on a 2D plane. And I think it's a very powerful cartoon because everybody in Tammany Hall, of course, was holding themselves unaccountable. Political cartoons is that so many of them are timeless. And this next drawing by Thomas Nast could run today for any politician. His name was the legendary Washington Post cartoonist whose career spanned 9 decades. Born in Chicago, Block dropped out of college to become the editorial cartoonist for the Chicago Daily News, and then went on to the Washington Post, where he spent 55 years. During the Red Scare of the 1950s, Herb Block was one of an all too few journalists who spoke out about the Red Scare instigated by Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy. It was Herb Block who coined the phrase McCarthyism, but Block is probably best remembered for his skewering of President Richard Nixon during the Watergate scandal. His cartoons of the disgraced president earned Block a spot on Nixon's enemy list. You can see here, Hysteria is climbing the ladder with a bucket of water, shouting, "Fire!" And this would have been drawn in the 50s in response to the Red Scare that was sweeping America at the time. And again, Block is sort of a master. If you look at his line in the forearm, the varying line weight differences and his use of shading really add impact and oomph to the cartoon. And also his clever use of caricature, the figure who's scrambling up the stairs looks completely hysterical, which of course he's intended to look. Here's I Am Not a Crook, and there's Richard Nixon, of course referring to the missing 18.5-minute angle, as though he's slowly sliding down into the bottom of the hourglass. A very effective visual, and you'll notice in the background again the use of the grease pencil, and also on the top of the hourglass there. This next individual is Bill Malden. Bill Malden got his start working for Stars and Stripes during World War II. He created the famous Willie and Joe cartoons that were in the Stars and Stripes of 2 rugged, scruffy-looking GIs that were immensely popular with the troops. And Malden of the Chicago Sun-Times he also drew the most famous political cartoon of all time when President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. It's interesting, the story goes that Malden was working on another cartoon when news of the tragedy broke, and he had to toss that cartoon aside and come up with something. And in a very short order, he came up with this. And the story I've been told is that he had a mirror, and he actually used the mirror to draw, put his hands over his face, and drew the representation of Lincoln. Can you imagine how difficult that would have been on deadline? But again, the use of black and the grease pencil in the background, ink in the foreground on the feature really made it pop. And I think it's a very successful editorial cartoon. This would have been created, when would it have been, 1963, excuse me. Malden was also a champion of civil rights before ink and the grease pencil to make certain parts of the cartoon pop and certain aspects of the cartoon fall into the background. Here's another civil rights cartoon. These were drawn, by the way, in 1960, 1962, so before the passage of the Civil Rights Act. And he's got these two surly-looking characters saying, "Let that one go. He says he doesn't want to be my equal." And this was drawn in 1960. So you can see political cartoonists oftentimes have been ahead of the curve in terms of advocating for change in the country. And unfortunately didn't last that long. But this is what Dr. Seuss did before he illustrated and wrote children's books. And here's one example of his cartoons that he drew for PM. It says, this is about the America First movement, and the woman is reading the book Adolf the Wolf to the two children. And the woman says, "And the wolf chewed up the children and spit out their bones. But those were foreign children, and it didn't really matter." And next, I'm going to turn this over to Nicky again.
Thank you. Just to preface the next few slides, I thought it would be really interesting in this talk to do some research about the Desert Sun's history in terms of sort of like the landmark moments of when we had an editorial page, when cartoons started running, when we started endorsing candidates and presidents. And to be honest, I could have researched for weeks and weeks, and it was really fun. But I just tried to pull a few interesting clips and don't quote me that this is for certain, but as far as my research went, and thank you, Tracy Conrad, who helped me just kind of learn how to comb through the archives. But here in this first slide, this is what I could see as the first editorial page that the Desert Sun launched, and this was in 1935. And the Desert Sun was started in 1927. And what's interesting here is, like many papers at the time, the editorial page had syndicated editorials. So it wasn't yet, maybe once in a while the editor/publisher would sort of add their point of view, but generally speaking, it was pulled from other publications nationwide. And so, yeah, this was just the sort of biggest presentation of the first one I could find. Next slide. Okay, so yeah, and then moving into the 40s and 50s, what happens here, just to note, is like a remarkable shift after World War II because of, and this is a bit of a generalization, but because of one, advertising. So advertisers all of a sudden didn't necessarily love partisan, papers. They wanted to be able to sell their products in a way that was to the most amount of consumers. And so they had a weigh-in or a influence on print newspapers. And then in television, broadcast TV and the advent of fairness and the fairness doctrine, it sort of ramped up this beginning of what sort of we're still, maneuvering through today, which is the idea of objectivity and less bias. And I would say those two components had a huge effect, and I'm going to continue on to the Desert Sun, but just for print newspapers in particular. Next slide. Okay, so here's an example of one of the first letters to the editor that I could find, and it's written by a woman named Hazel Rush Peck, and this is in 1945, and what she's basically very poignantly discussing is the importance of some speakers that are coming to the PSUSD school district to, there's like a set of speakers coming, and I'm happy to share this after if anybody's interested, but she sort of like very beautifully writes why and how important it is to have these sort of discussions amongst people. And why this is here is because, jumping from the last slide, letters to the editor marked, again, the public's involvement all of a sudden, right? And how important it was and remains to this day to have voices that were not the publisher, not the editor, not other newspaper editors, right? And so from 1945 onward, letters to the editor were huge. And then, next slide. For a while, they became Villagers' Views, and this is two short letters from 1948. And, so this one was, the person is just signed at IMM, and they're sort of opining about Palm Springs, the obligation to build civic buildings, but the sort of tax effects it has on the residents. And so in a way, what was so compelling about this other one is just about a gentleman basically visiting Chicago. But more interestingly, I don't know. But more interestingly for this one, these letters could run today. And I think it's the same thing that comes up with some of these cartoons is just, I just was blown away by how wonderful it is that they existed then and that they exist now, because some of these verbatim could be printed in the Desert Sun today. So, next slide. Two more slides. So then this was just, I had to throw in because this was one of the earliest political cartoons I could find. And what was so interesting about this cartoonist, it's Lieutenant Colonel J.H. Ficklin. He was actually based at, is it camp? Oh, I have it written down there. But he was based at a camp in Indio. And so from his physical having to be here, he produced this You're in the Army Now cartoon series. And so the Desert Sun began running those, and obviously in a very timely moment. And then, next slide. Last but not least, so this, again, these are two of the earliest endorsements I could find. And the one on the left is for Congressman Pat Martin. And I think one just compelling note about Ford is that, he lived here after his presidency and was like a huge advocate of helping to get this library built and was here for its opening. So anyway, I just thought that was an interesting side note. And those are my slides. Thank you.
Thank you. And then back to the editorial cartoons, the rebirth of the genre in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Beginning in the mid-60s, a breath of fresh air was blown into the profession of editorial cartooning with the arrival of cartoonist Pat Oliphant from Australia. Oliphant started at the Denver Post before moving to the Washington Star. He brought with him a strong emphasis on humor and solid draftsmanship, featuring bold lines and witty captions, inspired by Mad magazines and several other Australian and British cartoonists. Oliphant's work revolutionized the profession of editorial cartooning, and he was at one time voted the best cartoonist working in America by his colleagues. Here he is, Pat Oliphant. And this is an example of his work. It's the U.S. Mail Service is a snail, and the postman is saying, cancel Saturday delivery, heck, just when we was gaining on it. I love Oliphant's drawing style. He makes such effective use of varying line weight and incredible use of black to draw your eye through the cartoon. Just look at the different types of brushwork he has going there. He's got the cross-hatching on the shell. He's got the scrumbled sort of look on the postage mail bags. and then the darker, bolder lines on the mailman and on the snail himself. Really an effective, beautifully rendered cartoon. This next cartoon was drawn when Ronald Reagan took over from Jimmy Carter. Your ship, Captain! Again, notice his use of black, the two figures, the background. And what's interesting about this is that he draws water with very few lines. He doesn't actually draw wave after wave after wave. He just draws several dozen lines here in the foreground around the wheel and around each of the characters, and that suggests water. It's really a beautifully rendered cartoon. Oliphant was a master of his craft. And this, we were talking, Nicky was mentioning about editorials that could run today and cartoons that could run today. This next cartoon was drawn during the Cold War, but it could easily have been run today. And that is Uncle Sam as the drunk W.C. Fields with the NATO chickens there, standing up to the Soviet tank saying, "Hold steady, men. Our show of unity seems to have them bamboozled." And again, Oliphant was a master of brushwork. He would paint this with brush and ink. And look at the mud in the foreground and even the water. He's drawing water without drawing water, which I find to be absolutely amazing. And then, of course, he brings in the whimsical element of the drunken Uncle Sam as W.C. Fields and the NATO chickens, which I think are just brilliant. This next guy is Jeff McNelly. Born in 1947, McNelly dropped out of college to become cartoonist for the Richmond newspaper and eventually wound up at the Chicago Tribune. His heavy reliance on humor and visual satire, coupled with his amazing drawing ability, meant that his highly influential cartoons packed a punch. McNelly inspired a generation of young cartoonists, myself included, with his acerbic wit and his incredible drawing talent. Sadly, he passed away in 2000 at the age of 52. Hi there, we're doing another special on violence in America, as a public service, of course. Look at his just incredibly effective use of line work here. The brush work is just gorgeous. You can see the strong, solid lines in the foreground figures, and then the very loose, scrumbling cross-hatching in the background that makes the TV cameraman and the reporter pop forward. And also the garbage cans in the foreground here. So he has a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. And then the strong horizontal composition coming from the TV all the way down to the microphone to the woman. Really an effective drawing. Type of paper that has patterns in it that if you paint a chemical on it, it brings the pattern out. In this case, a line pattern. You can see up on the roof there, the sort of grayish looking area. That's where he's used the duo shade. And again, the composition is just wonderful. And the varying line weights and the use of black to draw your eye through the cartoon. A very successful political cartoon, whether you agree with the idea or not. And then closing out the 20th century, we have Jules Feiffer. Jules Feiffer, from 1956 until 1997, he was on staff at the Village Voice. His multi-paneled work inspired a generation of alternative cartoonists. He was very famous for drawing this dancing figure, A Dance to Spring. And then, of course, he was also active. This would have been drawn in the 70s. He was actually 1991, excuse me. And this was one of his cartoons on Nixon. If you think everything your government tells you is a lie, and we know you think that, and we go out of our way to prove to you we're not lying, are we still lying, or are we telling the truth? And by now, how would we know? I included this next cartoon because I think it's one of the greatest political cartoons ever drawn. It was drawn by Jeff McNelly, and it was created after the Rodney King beatings in 1994. But it's a cartoon that's almost timeless, especially for us here in America. And I wanted to close out the show with this particular cartoon, which I think is just phenomenally effective. us.
Thank you, Mike and Nikki. So we purposely kind of ended this session at this point in history because we want to do another one of these next year and take it into the 21st century. So we'll hope you'll come back for that, but we do want to open it up to questions. We have, about 20 minutes here, so Carrie's going to be walking around with a microphone, and just raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question.
Okay, a question for you is, which came first, the artist or the commentator?
Do you mean in terms of myself personally? Well, I love to draw, and I always have, and my dad was involved in the art museum business, so I grew up around a lot of creative people, and I had a lot of great experiences and great interaction with artists and other creative people, and that sort of fueled my interest in art. And then I developed a love of politics, and the fusion of politics and art is a political cartoon. And so that's sort of how my career came together.
Hi, I'm just asking, although it's a strip cartoon, obviously, how would you classify or describe Doonesbury?
Doonesbury is sort of a hybrid, I think. It's a combination of political cartooning. He's won the Pulitzer for political cartooning, Gary Trudeau has. It's a hybrid of the comic strip and an editorial cartoon, and I think it's been an incredibly effective and incredibly influential comic strip, and I can't say enough good things about it, whether you agree with the politics or not.
I have a question about the operations. When you do a cartoon, do you work for a newspaper, or did you work for a newspaper? You did, correct?
Yes, I did. I worked on.
They pay you, correct?
Yes, I worked on staff.
Are you given assignments like a reporter, or do they pretty much let you have carte blanche on what you're going to draw, and what your opinion is as well?
Well, everything I drew, I was on staff at all the newspapers that were mentioned, Minneapolis, Detroit, and USA Today. And my job was sort of like a columnist, except instead of words, I was using drawings and a few words to express an opinion. As far as what I'm allowed to draw, everybody has an editor at a newspaper. And an editor's job is to save you from yourself. That's one of the editor's jobs. And I had good editors who saved me from myself on more than one occasion. So I was fortunate in that respect. Does that answer the question? No, I was not assigned. I mean, sometimes they would, but most of the time I was left to my own devices to talk about what I felt was important and the issues that concerned me. Now, it's no surprise that a newspaper that would be very conservative would hire a conservative cartoonist, or have a very conservative editorial page, I should say, would have a conservative cartoonist. Yeah, a little bit, but there was, throughout my career, I had a very high degree of editorial freedom. You're welcome.
Talking about censorship, you're syndicated, is that correct?
I was syndicated, yes.
Were you censored in some newspapers and not others?
Well, newspapers have a right to run what they want to run. If they subscribe to my work and they don't like a cartoon on a particular day, they're under no obligation to run it.
Would they direct you to change it and then consider it again, or
Not through syndication, no. They would, I would present something, and if they liked it, they could run it, and if they didn't, that was their choice.
I see. Well, I did notice that you did have two cartoons.
One of these cartoons.
There's no actual process. And people have asked me this all the time. How do you come up with ideas? The answer to that is I don't know. I just read a lot, and I drink an awful lot of caffeine, And I pace around and talk to myself, and eventually I come up with an idea. And the idea is the hard part, because people think, well, you've got it so easy with politics today, Donald Trump. Well, you can't draw about Trump every day. And he tends to suck the oxygen out of the room and take away from other topics. And the actual drawing itself can take anywhere from, I don't know, 4 to, I've spent upwards of 12 hours on a drawing before. Usually I start the night before, or I'd like to try to start the night before and work on the idea, and then I would have, when I was at USA Today, my deadline was 2 o'clock, so I'd work all the way up to my deadline. And it was always for the next day's publication, so there's no having a stockpile of cartoons, because you could draw a cartoon and then the issue changes. And that happens so many times in my career, where I'm drawing a cartoon and I'm really happy with it, and something changes in the news and the cartoon's irrelevant, so I have to throw it aside and come up with something else in an hour.
Thanks. Just a couple things. I have loved editorial cartoons since I was a little kid. That was one of the first things I ever looked at when I looked at the paper. And I have collected books of them from McNally and Oliphant and you and Steve Benson and a few other fantastic cartoonists. And it's one of the most disappointing things I've seen is that editorial cartoonists are some of the first to be laid off when papers start cutting back. And it's unfortunate. And Nicky, as a longtime Desert Sun subscriber, I appreciate the ones that you do put in. Can I ask you to put some more in? Please put some more in, because they are fantastic. But you brought up something really interesting when you brought up the Herb Block one of Lincoln after the JFK assassination. And I can picture him trying to do that very quick. Just curious, in your body of work, have you ever run into a situation where you have been working on something, and then all of a sudden a major news story breaks, the Columbia falls out
all the
or
time,
something, and you've had to just start from scratch and whip off something, and it turned out to be your best one ever?
Sometimes a spark of inspiration can be beneficial to creativity, but more often than not, it's just a lot of stress.
What sort of relationship did you have? I don't think Carson was your era, but the TV guys and then the Daily Show. Do you sometimes fantasize that could have been you doing the Daily Show?
Well, we were here first. Editorial cartoons have the Daily Show beat by a couple decades or more, actually centuries. So, yeah, it would be fun to write for those shows, though. Definitely.
I have a question. I'm curious about the art process itself. In architecture, it seems like it's gone more computerized with their CAD drawings and everything, and there's fewer architects that are actually doing hand drawings. Do you see a change coming to the editorial drawings as well?
Well, that change has already come. I mean, a lot of my work is created on the computer.
Potentially speak to it. Hi, how do you see AI influencing cartoons?
I mean, I think people will try to use AI to create cartoons, but I've gone into ChatGPT and said, "Hey, give me an idea on," I can't remember what it was, and it spit out like a 150-word explanation. So it's not there yet. I have a real problem with AI because it's trained on artists' work, so it's not an exact ripoff, but it's influenced by other people's artwork.
So Mike,
and they're uncompensated. I mean, we all have creative influences, but this is something entirely different.
So Mike, to be clear, this is all hand drawn, correct?
This is hand drawn, but you can see, for example, the platform that he's standing on. What I do is I take digital photos, and that's a digital photo I took of some wood, and then I cut it out and pasted it, and use the skew and rotate tools to create the platform. And I find that using digital photos really helps because that way it's really able to convey the visual effect of wood. Now the figures themselves are actually drawn in with a pen and ink the old-fashioned way. And they're scanned in, and then I bring them into Photoshop and color them in.
What happens to the original cartoon?
There really isn't much of an original. For this cartoon, there would be the white supremacist character and the character holding the Uncle Sam holding the binoculars, and that's really all there is to the original. Originals per se don't exist anymore in the world of digital art, and that's kind of sad in a way.
Do you see the influence of the political cartoon diminishing?
What do you think, Nick?
I don't think so. In fact, in the sort of 24/7 news cycle and social media and just being bombarded by everything all at once, every moment, I think like Julie or somebody mentioned in the beginning, it's just such a distilled visual representation in such a smart way that I don't think it's ever going to go away, and I'm grateful for that because it can sometimes really summarize a complex issue, whether you like it or not. And I think, just as an editor, we'll get letters all the time. They can be very triggering and polarizing in terms of the content, but they're very powerful still. So I think they're going to last, and I love them.
Mike, maybe you could comment, though, is the number of active political cartoonists declining?
Yes, it's dropped off very precipitously. What's changing is the model where a cartoonist is on staff at a newspaper. But we're also in an era, because of the internet, where more practitioners of the craft are out there than ever before. And newspapers used to be the gatekeepers. If you couldn't convince an editor to run your work, well, then you were out of luck. But now there are so many venues online for political cartoons, even social media, TikTok, Facebook, that the number of people actually creating political cartoons is up. What's changed is the number of people who are actually able to make a living drawing political cartoons.
Wouldn't you say that these are basically the original meme like you see on the internet now?
Yeah, I mean, we like the late night show, we also have memes beat. So lots of people like to follow what political cartoons do. I think the difference is that it's sort of like an opinion page itself. There are tons of opinions out there, but we have very few smart, intelligent, rational, well thought out opinions. And I think that's why people turn to newspaper editorial pages, is because it's not your Uncle Larry complaining over Thanksgiving dinner. It's a well-informed, rational, reasonable person who is intelligent, making intelligent commentary about the issues of the day on the newspaper editorial page. And that's why opinion pages are so important. They stand out in this sea of noise. And did you have something you wanted to add on that?
Any other questions? Please raise your hand. We have time for one or two more. There's one in the back here. There's someone coming with the mic. Just wait one minute.
I'm coming.
Hi, me again. I actually know Rick Geary of the National Lampoon really, really well. I'd like to know, do you go to San Diego Comic-Con, and are you going this year?
No, I've never gone to San Diego Comic-Con. I've gone to Comic-Cons where I live. We live about 20 miles north of Detroit in Michigan. And I've always wanted to go to San Diego Comic-Con. I know they're every year, and I see the photos, and I just think one of these.
In your interest in your lives, the art, like drawing, and then, the political commentary, interest in doing that comes after, or is it the desire to write political commentary and then
comes first? There are so many different ways that people come at this that it's hard to say that they're just one way. But I do think that all cartoonists have one thing in common, and that's that they've loved to draw ever since they were young. And that art led into an interest in politics, and art and politics have a very long history together.
All right, I think with that, I'm going to bring up Randy Lovely, who's president of the board of the Coachella Valley Journalism Foundation, for some final remarks. Randy.
Thank you, Julie. I just want to put out a couple thank yous first. Thank you to Mike and Nicky for such a great program. And I need to thank my fellow board members, Carrie and Julie, for putting together today's program. The Rancho Mirage Library, what a wonderful jewel this is for the community. And thank you to all of you. The questions you asked were so insightful and so provocative. What a great audience. I really appreciate your time and attention. I hope you've enjoyed the program today, and I hope that we have an opportunity to come back again with more programming in the future. The Coachella Valley Journalism Foundation has been around for about 4 years, and our job is to celebrate and support local journalism. And so I think, as you saw from today's program, the role that journalism plays in the community is incredibly, incredibly important. And I want to share a couple of what I think are pretty startling facts. Newspapers are vanishing at an average rate of more than 2 a week. Since 2005, the U.S. has lost almost 2,900 newspapers, including more than 130 confirmed closings or mergers just in the last year. Local broadcast stations and radio stations have seen similar reductions. There are 204 counties in the United States that have no local news outlet, and about 55 million residents live in a community in which they have no local news source. In addition to losing almost a third of its newspapers, the U.S. has lost almost 2/3 of its newspaper journalists. And while legitimate news is diminishing, the number of fake news sites driven by AI has ballooned by more than 1,000% in the past year. That's what led to the creation of the foundation. We're really fortunate in this community to have a number of really good media outlets. We're not one of those communities with what they now call a news desert. But we can't take that for granted. And so what we do is try to support those local news organizations by raising money to help give them interns each summer. We're in the process right now of selecting interns for various newsrooms this summer, by supporting Nicky's position at the Desert Sun, by funding reporting projects. And I like to use a quote that Walter Cronkite said, and that is, "Journalism is what is needed to make democracy work." I think it's pretty simple. And at a time when our country is pulled in so many different directions, I really do think that journalism is a core part of the glue that helps a community thrive. And so I appreciate you being here today. I hope if you want to learn more about the foundation, we are at cvjf.org. We have free bookmarks for you in the back of the room. I hope you'll take one of those as you leave. You can sign up for our monthly newsletter. And we also have a couple of examples of Mike's outstanding work for you to take a look at in the back as you leave. So thank you so much for being here. We appreciate your time.